And thank you also to the organisers for inviting me here. It's actually a pleasure to be here, despite the best efforts of the Border Police and the train drivers to delay my arrival, for which I apologise. Nothing to do, well, there's something to do with me. Yes, good. Right, so what I'm going to talk about is language change processes, and I'm going to start off by talking about sort of universal aspect of language change processes in a very sort of fluffy kind of way. So universal just means it happens again and again in some vague kind of way. And what I want to do is I want to kind of relate this behaviour that is seen repeatedly to what people are actually doing in terms of their kind of linguistic, face-to-face linguistic behaviour. And we're going to use an idea from physics, which is symmetry, to try and classify different explanations. And then symmetry implies constraints on what can happen, and then we can sort of use that to sort of say these things, these types of explanations seem to work better than these types of explanations. That's kind of the idea. But towards the end, I hope to move on more to the idea of universality in terms of things that everybody are doing that might be relevant to language change processes. So this relates a little bit to what we heard about yesterday in terms of kind of virtuoso poetry, that the idea was that this could be culturally specific. So what we want to do is we want to tease apart aspects which are genuinely universal versus things which are culturally specific. And I think we're starting to get some ideas as to how to tease these things apart. So that's roughly what's going to happen, hopefully. We'll see how it goes. Last time I gave this talk, it fit into 10 minutes. I don't think that's going to happen today. Okay, so here's an example of a language change from the past. This is Brazilian Portuguese future. I know nothing about Brazilian Portuguese, but we do have this graph. And what this graph shows are 4 different ways of marking the Brazilian Portuguese future. And so if you just look at all the instances of future in various texts, I think these were plays, and then you can just kind of look at what fraction of them were of this type, or of this type, this type, that type. And what you see as you go through the centuries that there's something which was very uncommon in the 16th century, and it rises and becomes very common now. So it's a language change. Okay. So the thing that people will tell you, if you ask them, what's the nature of the change, and the word that they use is S-curve. Okay, so it starts slow, takes off, and tails off again. And it's in the shape of an S, viewed from an appropriate angle. Okay. So the key features is that it starts slow, there's a period of rapid growth, and then it tails off. Okay, that's the S-curve. But I'm not particularly wed to any specific form of the S-curve. It doesn't have to be a logistic and logit, or pick your favourite S-curve. It doesn't have to be any of those. It's just start slow, rises, and then tails off. Okay, so that's one example. So as people often say, is it the plural of anecdote is not data? I don't know anyway. So here's another example, French negation. So very appropriate to where we are quite now in the sort of negative mood of the city. Here we go. This one goes back all the way back to the 12th century. So this is an entire PhD's worth of work, which probably points to where we don't actually have that much data, historical data, it's 3 years or whatever. Let's put all this together. Similar pattern to this, which is pa. As you know, back in the 12th century, not 25% usage, but now is the way of saying no or not in French. And again, we have an S-curve. This one's quite interesting because it doesn't actually start at 0. It starts higher up. And there's also kind of other things going on here. So around about here, you've got 4 different variants, one of which is the majority, and these ones kind of kicking around quite happily at fairly constant frequency for quite some time, and then boom, something happens. Okay? And I think there is information in here as well as here, which I'll come to towards the end. Another example. Right, so this is my favourite. This one's really good. You'll like this one. It's really good. Right, okay. So Canada. So probably at home in your living room you have some. I need a picture for this slide. Some piece of furniture could accommodate 2 to 3 people, or possibly 1 cat. Probably pointing towards a television, or if you're refined, as most people in France are, a fireplace, or something like that. So, does anyone know what I'm talking about? Yeah, okay, sofa. Okay, so you're probably setting that up. So, now this is interesting again, this is a social linguistic study, so the way that they look back in time is to look at the question of the older people. So it's got an apparent time survey. So if you look at the youngsters, those are reflective of what's going on now. Look at people who are over 80, that's supposed to be reflective of what was going on about 60 years ago. Okay? And what you see if you look back in time in this way, you'll find that people like to use the word Chesterfield. Okay? And here's my favourite, Davenport is down here somewhere. Okay. So and then Chesterfield falls out of fashion, and couch actually is what the Canadians say. In Britain, I think it's sofa. Okay. So this is yet another S curve. So the the observation is that S curves, they just keep happening, they keep happening, they keep happening. So what you want is some sort of robust explanation for that, which doesn't really depend too much on specific details of the situation you're in, but one that is also related in some useful way to linguistic theory and people's actual behaviour. Okay, so let's fix some terminology and build a simple model. So we're going to assume an idealised S-curve where you start off with basically no usage of whatever the innovation is. The innovation is innovated, so there's an innovation phase, and I'm not really going to talk about that innovation process. So we heard quite a bit about innovation yesterday. Like for Toy, I'm just going to assume that innovation has happened, okay, somehow. What we're interested in is the next step, which is propagation. So the innovation exists, but somehow this new thing becomes the one that everybody uses. And that's the phase that we're interested in. Now, in the language of dynamical systems theory, which hopefully some people are familiar with, what we've got going on here is that there's an unstable fixed point down here, and there's a stable fixed point up here. So at some level you can just say, well, all we need is a model that's got one of those. Here's one, that's the solution, and that's the end of my talk. Okay, good. Lunch is not arriving for 45 minutes, so I suppose I ought to say something. What this neglects to do is it neglects to tell us, what on earth has this got to do with specific theories about language use and language behaviour. Okay, there's nothing in this that tells us anything about what people are doing, why they might be doing it, and whether we can, if you can go into the literature, look at various explanations and say, aha, we prefer this explanation. So that's what I want to do. So I'm going to do that within an evolutionary framework. It's not actually strictly necessary to use this framework to talk about things I'm going to, but it will help explain some of the language, some of the nomenclature that we've chosen to describe different types of theory with. Okay. So I'm going to give you just a quick sort of 2-minute version of an entire undergraduate course in evolution. And it looks a bit like this. So let's think about DNA, because that's kind of simplest. So here's a chunk of DNA. And in a general picture, you can refer to this as a replicator because it's a structure that is replicated. Okay. And in particular, I'm going to focus on this bit of DNA and what happens when it's replicated. And basically one of two things can happen. It can either be replicated faithfully, no change in the DNA when the organism reproduces, or it can change. Okay. Now the colours aren't too good here, but that's kind of yellow and this is a bit red. Okay, so it's changed. Okay. So we've got replication, faithful replication, and we've got variations. This is the process by which you create new things in biology. Mutate a bit of DNA. Okay. Now, in biology, there's this really, really, really complicated and annoying thing called a genotype-phenotype map. We're going to kind of ignore that to some extent, but the point is that your DNA will transform into some sort of organism in some complicated way that nobody understands. But that organism has some behaviour and interacts with other organisms. Okay? So in this formal language, we're calling the organism the interactor. So the interactor has some DNA that has provided one contribution to its properties, although there are others from development, and it's interacting. And this variation is supposed to produce kind of variation in the phenotype. So here I've got a mouse, or ordinary mouse, and here I've got a super fast mouse that is capable of running away from predators. And you need a predator in order to act as some kind of selection. So the thing that these are really interacting with is some operator of selection. Okay? So this is when we had a problem with these in a place that I lived, we installed specifically this model of these things, and it very much dealt with the problem caused by these, which is good. Served its purpose, but she's now in retirement. And the idea here being is that if this one can run faster than that one, then more of these will get killed, and therefore we end up propagating more of this mutation, and then that this DNA sequence can grow in the population, and that's evolution. Okay, good. So the point here is that this is a two-step process, right? You have the generation of variation, which happens at the point where the replicator is replicated. But then you have some other thing going on, selection, which is dealing with propagation steps. This kind of maps on quite nicely to this idea that innovations are created and then something takes it on and can propagate. And you can think of this usefully in terms of selection acting on an interactor and replication going on in the background. Okay, good stuff. So there are lots and lots of people who have taken sort of evolutionary ideas and applied them to cultural evolution, language change and stuff. And it's very important not just to kind of relabel, not to take the specific relationship, for example, between the replicator and the interactor too seriously, because these things can change and are allowed to change in different evolutionary contexts. So to apply this to language, we need to throw away most of what's on this slide apart from the terminology, okay? And then rebuild again our theory. So so my collaborator is Bill Croft, and in his wonderful book, which I urge you all to read, although it's now gone out of print, it's going to cost you €300 to get a copy. So if I'm feeling poor, I shall just sell my copy to someone. In this book, it kind of sets out very nicely how to build up an evolutionary picture of language change. So we have to identify what's the replicator. And what Bill argues is what the replicator is the utterance, okay, what you say. So this is the thing that people replicate when they speak. So every word that I'm using now has been said by somebody before. Okay? If I wasn't doing that, you wouldn't understand what I was talking about. You may not be understanding anyway for completely different reasons, but I am at least using words that you recognise. Okay? I hope. Good. This is the point. So utterances are replicated, and they can be replicated faithfully, or you can introduce an innovation. Okay, now here I'm using the example of words, but we can think more generally of grammatical structures, word orders, that kind of thing, not necessarily just words. So what might be generating variation? Well, we heard about this yesterday, I think, in the context of music, specifically. So Bill's take on language is that some of the things that contribute to variation are things like expressivity. Okay, if I didn't want to communicate any meaning, then it would be very simple. I could just use one word for everything. Okay, so every time when you often want to communicate something you haven't communicated before. Now, ironically, I have communicated that particular phrase before, but nevertheless, I struggle to find a way to articulate it. But nevertheless, when you're trying to communicate, then quite often you're putting things together in new ways because something slightly different happens. So today, I experienced for the very first time in my life a parade of 14 police vans, one after the other, going over the bridge over there with their sirens on. So there, okay, 14 police vans, one after the other with their sirens on. Okay, I've never needed to say that before, but nevertheless I had tools to be able to do that. So that generates variation. Other things that generate variation are things like functional pressures. So for example, it might just be easier to say some words or phrases or vowel sounds than others. It might be easier to distinguish them with your ears and so on. So there are a whole bunch of things here that generate variation. So that's all good. So the interactor, what's the interactor? Well, here's a typical language using agent, one who particularly likes shouting, defending Hadrian's Wall, but probably for the wrong team. Okay. Now, that's a joke for the Scots there. Right. Okay. So the.
I didn't get it. I thought it was funny.
Okay, fair enough. So Hadrian's Wall is a wall that was built by the Emperor Hadrian to keep out the pesky Scots from invading the
We can have an argument about that later.
Okay. This is I didn't do history at school. I did woodwork. And there were Romans kind of shouting at Picts and Scots on this wall. Okay, and that's a Roman. Okay. So where were we? So this is a language using agent. Is an interactor, and the key point to make here is that the replicator, which is the utterance, and the interactor don't have the same relationship between each other as DNA and an organism. Okay, this is kind of important. Okay, and then what's selection? So selection acts on the replicators via the interactor. This is the point. So what is selection? Here, under Bill's theory, it's things like social value type things. So if you go and talk to a sociolinguist, one of the things that they do is they condition variation in language on a whole range of factors, including linguistic factors, but they also condition it on social status and things like that. So age of the speaker, gender of the speaker, how many friends they have, what kind of occupation they have, that kind of thing. And so they find, people use different, make different choices depending on who they're talking to and what position they hold in a social structure and so on. And so the idea is that, certainly to my mind, Chesterfield sounds like something that old people say, and couch sounds like something that another group of people say, and I might kind of say, well, I don't want to sound old, so I'm going to say couch, so it's not to sound old. Okay, so that's the kind of selection operation that's going on there, and it's associated in some way with the properties of interactors. Good. So really, to take away from this, this is just to show that sitting right in the background of all this is a sort of a formal framework for describing changes by replication. But the important words to take away from this are replicator, which here is the utterance of the thing that's being replicated, and then interactor, which are the people who are involved making use of this system of utterances. Okay. Everything else you can basically forget, if you wish. Good. Right, so now we are going to start to think about actual theories for how language change, and then we're going to place them within that framework. So another book that I wholeheartedly recommend is Bill Lebov's books, I can't remember, there's a Principles of Linguistic Change, something like that, and they're big sort of doorsteps. So this is volume 2, and in volume 2 he talks about social factors, and he's discussing various ways to explain changes that have happened, various verbal theories. And there's one that he ascribes to Sturtevant, which says that linguistic change arises from the association of particular forms of speaking with the social traits of opposing social groups. So what this is saying is that I'll be motivated to say couch rather than Chesterfield because of the group of people who use these different words. Okay. So we call this, so more generally it's referred to as an act of identity, that you are making a statement about who you are by the language that you're using, and that will influence your choice of language. And we call this process replicator selection because it is a choice that is made due to a property of the replicator, property of the utterance. Okay. Because couch has some property that Chesterfield doesn't. Okay. That's the idea. So to talk about symmetry, okay, so we want to do this business of relating types of explanation to symmetries. You're going to do a thought experiment. The thought experiment works like this. So this is sort of some network of language users. And these lines show sort of pairs of agents who talk to each other. Okay, so it's a very small community, this one. And we're saying, so at some initial time, we start off, one user is using the innovation and everybody else is using an existing convention. And we can run this forwards in time. Okay, so you can do this in a model, or you can do it in a lab experiment, and you can just look at the data, it doesn't really matter. So there's time going on here. Fine, and so the system changes. Great, now the thought experiment component of this comes in now, which is we rewind to the beginning of time here, and what we do is we just invert the two variants. So we just say everyone who was a Chesterfield user becomes a couch user and vice versa. Okay? And now we run that forwards in time under the same dynamics. And the point being is that if couch has a different kind of value, if it's preferred by the speakers more than Chesterfield, then the outcome of this will be statistically different. Okay? If there's an asymmetry between these two word choices and these two linguistic variables, then when you run this forward in time, then you get something different. So it says that the dynamics of couch are different to the dynamics of Chesterfield. And that tells you that these replicators are not equivalent, and that some selection is acting on them. So that's what we mean by a symmetry between between relabeling the variants, is that Chesterfield and couch are not interchangeable. Okay, that's what it's saying. But it gives you a way to identify. So this type of theory implies the absence of this type of symmetry. Okay, so that's kind of important. Okay, let's think of another one. So that was replicators, so it may come as no surprise that the other type of asymmetry is associated with the interactors, the people. Okay. Which often, so a lot of people in biology, in biology it's always thinking about replicators, selective advantage of the DNA is the main thing. It's rarely thought about, properties of the interactors rarely come into biological theories, but they're quite important in language theories.
Sorry, Richard, but
yeah.
the system is deterministic?
No, it doesn't have to be. So you do this in a statistical sense. So if the probability distribution of variant B in the...
But that's why I don't understand why you claim that, I mean, so you would expect symmetry. So I would not expect symmetry anyway. I mean, if you start from different initial conditions...
No, so you start from the same initial condition. All you're doing is relabeling A and B. So if you're saying, so say in the voter model, for example...
But with the same random numbers, yeah.
Well, yeah, okay, with the same random numbers, or you can just do it in a statistical sense. You can say the probability distribution of B at time t, given starting from just 1b, equals that of the probability distribution of A after time t, starting with A in the case that B was. Yep. So you can do it on a realization by realization basis, or you can do it over in the ensemble.
I actually have another clarification question. I lost track of whether the nodes in your network were words or whether they were people.
People.
They're people. Okay, so yeah, I got it.
Okay. So what we're doing is we're just saying, so yeah, let's make this concrete. So we could put couch in the mouth of Vittorio, and it spreads through this room. Okay, in some way, we can look at the distribution where it gets to after time t. We could rewind to beginning, start with Chesterfield, do the same experiment, and see where it gets to. And if statistically they're the same, then we say these things are symmetric. Okay. Whether this is really a helpful classification is unclear. Good. Right, so the other type of explanation that we identified in the literature was what we call a Bloomfield-inspired mechanism, which is actually quite fascinating. So this basically says that language change simply reflects changes in interlocutor frequencies, which in turn are the result of changes in social preferences and attitudes. So what he's kind of arguing for is basically it's a social network effect. Okay, so the idea being is that if I talk more to you guys over there than you guys over there, then I'll end up doing more what they do. Okay? So this is the principle of density. So here the asymmetry, now you can see, is between you guys and you guys because I'm not treating you equally to the way that I'm treating you. Okay? So again, we can do the same sort of thought experiment, but I think I'm just going to sort of skip through that because this one's actually a little bit harder to explain, and I think will confuse people. But basically you can just do the same thing, that you can now just move the innovator from one person to another, and then you can ask him, does this thing have the same chance of propagating or not? So now does it matter if Vittorio or Janet is the innovator? Okay. Good, right, so let's just guilt frame our theory so that you know what it is, and just try and understand what we're going on about here. So what this kind of thinking about symmetries does is it allows us to build up a classification of different types of verbal explanation for change, and then we're going to try and relate that to sort of quantitative outcomes. So, the simplest propagation mechanism that you can think of is what we call conformance to a convention. So, you just plonk yourself in a group of people who are using language, and you just replicate what other people are doing in proportion to the frequencies that people are doing it, and you treat everybody equally, you treat all the variation equally, there's just no variation whatsoever. Okay, and so there's no asymmetries in this model, and this we call a neutral evolution model. It's also called drift in the population genetics literature. You can do a slight refinement, slight tweak to this model, which allows very limited variation in the way that you treat people. So all it says is that I'm allowed to interact with different people with different frequencies, but the way that you view me has to be the same as the way that I view you. Okay, so there's no asymmetries between me and Vittorio. So everything that I do has the same effect on Vittorio as everything that Vittorio does has the same effect on me. Okay. But I'm allowed to interact with Vittorio more often than Janet. Okay. So there's the tweak to that. And this is called accommodation theory, which has mostly been advocated by Peter Treadwell and others. And we call this neutral interactor selection because there is some distinction between interactors, but it is of a neutral type because there's no actual asymmetry between pairs. And you can turn this up a bit, where you now say that I pay more attention to Vittorio because he's an important professor in Rome, and he doesn't pay so much attention to me because I'm just a lecturer in Edinburgh. Okay, and there's an asymmetry there. And this we call weighted interactor selection. So more weight is given by me to Vittorio than Vittorio to me. Okay, so slowly building up the amount of asymmetry. And then the final thing you can do is you can now say that variants are asymmetric, that Chesterfield or couch is preferred to Chesterfield due to some intrinsic property that it has or has acquired. So here we go. So we've got a sequence of progressively less symmetric models And to each of them we have related a specific sort of verbal explanation, verbal theory in the linguistics literature. Good. So, what do these do? So from now I'm going to talk in the context of a specific model system, which we've called the utterance section model of language change, and can be found in a FISREV-E paper that we wrote in 2006, with some slight refinement to it that appeared a couple of years ago in Language. And so the model is this, and I mean, if you don't like the model, it doesn't really matter. It's just a way of actually building in all the things that I've just talked about into a quantitative model, and then we can see how that model behaves. That we kind of know from statistical physics that if we built a different model that had the same sort of symmetries and properties of it, then it probably would have behaved roughly the same way. That's a useful statement. Yeah. Okay, good. So the model works like this. So we have a network of language users, and what they have in their head is some memory of which variants have been used by people that they've spoken to. So for example, this could be like the Brazilian Portuguese future. I mean, that had 4 ways of marking it. So this person thinks that this variant here has been used a bit, this one's been used a bit more, this one's been used less often. Okay. So this sort of frequency histogram is built up through repeated interactions with other members of the speech community in a way that I'm about to explain. So here's our network. So in each time step what we do is we just pick a pair of speakers to interact. So it could be this pair and this person and this person. And the probability that we pick a particular pair, I and J, is some probability Gij, and this can vary between pairs. So you talk to someone you live with much more often than someone you see only once a year at conferences. Okay? But this is necessarily symmetric. For me talking to you, if we have an interaction, if I'm talking to Eduardo, then he may not be listening to me, but we are at least interacting. So it's symmetric. Okay. Good. Then what is the interaction? Well, both speakers, what they do is that they look at their score and they say, well, in this conversation we're about to have, we're going to use the future tense 3 times, t times. Okay, so we're going to produce t instances of marking of the future tense, and we're going to draw each one at random from this distribution. So hearing the earlier talks, probably we shouldn't be doing it at random. We should probably be there should probably be some correlations between these events, but we're just kind of working with a simple one. Okay, so that's what they do, and then what the speakers, how do they react to this? So what they do is they basically say, okay, so here's my frequency histogram. This is what I said. So the alpha, beta, gamma here label the variance. I pay some attention to what I say. So that's kind of self-reinforcing, goes back into my store. So so here it's kind of 1/6 alpha, 1/3 beta, and a half gamma. So I kind of put that back into my store in proportion to the respective frequencies. But I also listen to what the other person did, and I kind of feed that back in as well. And I can do this with different weights. So the point is that speaker I gives a weight to Hij to speaker J's utterances. The crucial thing here is that Hij does not need to be the same as Hji. So this is the bit where, for example, in the extreme case, this could be 1 for one person going one way and 0 for the other, which means that speaker I is listening to speaker J, and speaker J is totally dismissing what speaker I is saying. So around here, so this part is symmetric and this part is asymmetrical. Okay. Now there's a tweak. So the tweak that comes in from this paper here is that so this n here is the number of tokens uttered by speaker I of type V. So in this case, for example, it would be, so alpha would be 1 utterance of type alpha. So the fraction of all the tokens is 1/t. And then we put this into a function f. So what this function f does is it allows us to incorporate biases based on frequency. So so if f is just equal to its argument, then it's completely unbiased. What it says is that if half of what you just said was a variant 1, I will assume that you use variant 1 50% of the time, and that is the weight that kind of goes back into my memory. However, I could bias it. I could say, if you said 75% of one of the variants, I could go, that's the majority. I'm now going to caricature you as an only variant 1 speaker, so I could just turn the frequency up to 1, which increases slightly. Or I could say, I prefer couch over Chesterfield, so I will systematically, each time I hear a couch, I'll give that slightly more weight than Chesterfield before putting it back into my store. So it allows you to incorporate these kind of biases, which may be the kinds of things which are consistent across communities. So once you've gone through this whole process, you denormalize the store. That basically means you just make sure all these frequencies are up to 1 and you just keep repeating. Okay, so what this model does is it picks out pairs of people from a community, gets them to talk to each other, and they modify their own behavior through various, by combining various things, which is basically frequency of what they did, frequency of what the other person did, and they can apply biases both to the identity of speakers and to linguistic behavior itself. So it allows you to build in all the things that I talked about, and just to highlight where those things are. Oh, that was a bit too much of a fade, wasn't it? Okay, so the neutral interaction selection that I talked about goes in with GIJ, these interaction frequencies. The weighted interaction selection comes in with these H's, which allows you to vary the extent to which, vary the asymmetry between pairs of speakers. And then the replicator selection can go into this F. It can place a bias on one form over another. So that's how all these things get built into the model. Good. Right, so that was the hardest part of the talk. The rest is now just pictures. Okay, so we can bond these models. So we can do neutral evolution. So neutral evolution is the case where we just say there are no differences between anybody, there are no differences between word forms, no differences between linguistic variants. And you run it, and what do you see? Well, what you see is that most innovations fail. Okay, so you just start off something new, just been done for the first time, and it's very, very likely just to get wiped out straight away because you've got an existing convention which most people are using, so the chances of it catching on are very small. Okay? However, of course, occasionally the innovation propagates. But what do we notice? It just kind of wobbles around all over the place. Yeah? And why? Well, it's because there's no differentiation being applied. Okay? It's just saying everything is equal. So I don't care if it's Carrick or Chesterfield. Just like again, so these a couple of years ago in Wimbledon, there was this tennis match that went on for like 50 sets or something like that. It just kind of kept going and going and going because no one could win. What you had was just two evenly matched players. You just one won a game, one won a game, one won a game, one won a game, and it lasted for 2 days. Okay? And it's basically the same thing here. If you've got two linguistic variants that are equally matched, then it's really hard for one of them to become a winner because they just keep going back and forth and fighting each other. That's exactly what you get there. And as far as we're aware, we have never seen in the literature a language change that has followed a trajectory that has looked like this. Okay? Now, you could be saying, oh, well, isn't there some sort of propagation bias going on there? Because I would be very surprised if somebody would devote the 3+ years of their PhD to an instance where a language feature didn't change. Okay? I mean, it would be a bit of a perverse thing to do. If you're interested in language variation and change, you probably didn't go to the case of saying, oh, here's a case where somebody tried marking a future tense in a different way and it didn't work. Okay? It would be, we're interested in the cases where a change happened. Right? So you are applying a conditioning to the data, conditioning on the fact that a change occurred. So some people have actually argued that this neutral evolution model can give you a nice kind of S-curve trajectory on the basis that, well, it has to start from 0 when it's innovated, and it has to go to 1 at the point that the change has gone through. And then if you interpolate between something that goes from 0 and 1, then it's going to kind of look like an S-curve. So what this plot shows here is the probability distribution of the frequency of the innovation as a function of time. So the darker it is, the more likely a particular frequency of the innovation is over time. And if you average over this distribution, you get this nice smooth S-curve. Okay. So what this line here is, which you probably can't see, so there it is. What this line here is an average over a conditioned ensemble of language changes. So it could be argued that actually, once you average over these fluctuations, you do see the empirical data. However, I would say that that's not what you're doing with the empirical data. You're looking at individual instances of change. You are conditioning on the fact that changes happen, and then you're looking at single instances. And as we saw, those single instances have big fluctuations on them. Okay? You get this kind of going forward and coming back again. So we are actually sceptical as to whether you can actually advance this as a reasonable description of the data. So let's kind of go up this hierarchy of models. So the next one was this case of neutral interactor selection. So what that says now is that I'm allowed to differentiate between people by the frequency with which I interact with them, but you are not allowed to treat what I do differently to how I treat what you do. Okay, so me and Vittoria are symmetric, me and Eduardo are symmetric, and so on. But I'm allowed to interact with Eduardo and Vittoria at different frequencies. And And this is the one that maps onto accommodation theory. So what it says is that if you just take this h function symmetric, the weight is symmetric, then you have accommodation theory. And I was very privileged. The first time I gave this talk, that Peter Trotker was actually in the audience, and he said, yes, that's exactly what my theory is saying. So I have this on very good authority. That's the kind of thing he was arguing for. And this is a very nice model, because what it does is it makes a really quite, well, we thought surprising prediction was that it does not matter what interaction frequencies you have between pairs and how the social network structure is organized. It always takes the same amount of time for an innovation to propagate through the community. So the experts on voter models will know that this is a property that's associated with something called link dynamics, which is where you pick links of update rather than individuals of update. And it basically comes down to the symmetry here, that the link is symmetric going both ways, so the probability that the innovation flows from one person to another is equal to as it flows the other way. Okay. And a consequence of that is that no matter what social network structure you have, the time it takes for an innovation to propagate through the community is independent of the social network structure, which is a really cool result, and there's a graph that demonstrates that it's true. And this was kind of useful for us to actually apply this accommodation theory to the case of new dialect formation in New Zealand. And what we found systematically was that when you take n up to realistically large speech communities, tens of thousands of speakers, then the time it would take for the propagation to go through the community was just way longer than the 50 years that the change actually happened on. So again, this type of model, not only does it have really big fluctuations in it, but it also implies very long change time scales. And it's the same sort of tennis analogy that is responsible for that. Good. So let's keep going and try and find a model that works. Okay, so weighted interactor selection. So this is now the case where you're allowed to have an imbalance between the impact that one person has on another and vice versa. Okay. So there's a very nice model of this in the literature by a guy called Rogers, who was most concerned about the diffusion of innovations in a general sense, usually technological innovations. So one of the examples he gives is boiling water in Peruvian villages, so trying to get people to boil their water so that they would be less susceptible to certain types of illnesses. And this was an innovation that failed to catch on due to various kind of complicated reasons. But he has this nice model where what he does is he divides his community into what he calls adopter categories, and he gives them a nice sort of binomial kind of shape distribution. So what you say is that there's a very small group of people who are the innovators. So about 15 years ago at a physics conference, these are the people who are using Macs as laptops. Okay? And then you have another group who are early adopters, who are people who kind of go, oh yeah, actually maybe I'll start using a Mac too, because because Victoria is using it. So on. Then you have the early majority, who and then the late majority and laggards. And the point in this model is that there's this kind of chain of influence. That there are some people who are very reluctant to adopt innovations, and they only do so once the majority of people have already adopted it. So you can divide people into these groups, and they can influence each other in this way. And the point is that the number of people in these groups follows this bell-shaped distribution. And the idea then is if you think now about the innovation propagating through the system, then it will necessarily start with a small number. It will start to get a bit faster, then it'll be very rapid, and then it will tail. And this should generate the S-curve. Okay? Except that it doesn't. Okay? So if you actually put in exactly this structure into the model that we were just talking about, then you get something which could be a little bit S-like down here, but it's mostly just a kind of what people would call an R-curve, which is one that basically just goes straight to the innovation.
So Richard, so what you put in, you build a network.
You build a network.
Only these are connected.
That's right. So you build a network of, let's say, one innovator, and they modify their own behaviour through combining various things, which is basically frequency of what they did, frequency of what the other person did, and they can apply biases both to the identity of speakers and to linguistic behaviour itself. So it allows you to build in all the things that I talked about, and just to highlight where those things are. Oh, that was a bit too much of a fade, wasn't it? Okay, so the neutral interactor selection that I talked about goes in with GIJ, these interaction frequencies. The weighted interaction selection comes from these H's, which allows you to vary the extent to which, vary the asymmetry between pairs of speakers. And then the replicator selection can go into this F. It can place a bias on one form over another. So that's how all these things get built into the model. Good. Right, so that was the hardest part of the talk. The rest is now just pictures. Okay. So we can run these models. So we can do neutral evolution. So neutral evolution was the case where we just say there are no differences between anybody, there are no differences between word forms, no differences between linguistic variants. And you run it, and what do you see? Well, what you see is that most innovations fail. Okay? So you just start off something new, just been done for the first time, and it's very, very likely just to get wiped out straight away because you've got an existing convention which most people are using, so the chances of it catching on are very small. Okay? However, of course, occasionally, the innovation propagates. But what do we notice? It just kind of wobbles around all over the place. Yeah? And why? Well, it's because there's no differentiation being applied. Okay? It's just saying everything is equal. So I don't care if it's Counter or Chesterfield. It's like a game, you know, so these, a couple of years ago in Wimbledon, there was this tennis match that went on for like 50 sets or something like that. It just kind of kept going and going and going because no one could win. What you had was just two evenly matched players. You just one won a game, one won a game, one won a game, one won a game, and it lasted for 2 days. Okay? And it's basically the same thing here. If you've got two linguistic variants that are equally matched, then it's really hard for one of them to become a winner because they just keep going back and forth and fighting each other. That's exactly what you get there. And as far as we're aware, we have never seen in the literature a language change that's followed a trajectory that has looked like this. Okay? Now, you could be saying, oh, well, isn't there some sort of publication bias going on there? Because I would be very surprised if somebody would devote the 3+ years of their PhD to an instance where a language feature didn't change. Okay? I mean, it would be a bit of a perverse thing to do. If you're interested in language variation and change, you probably didn't go to the case of saying, oh, you know, here's a case where somebody tried marking a future tense in a different way and it didn't work. Okay? It would be, you know, we're interested in the cases where a change happened. Right? So you are applying a conditioning to the data, conditioning on the fact that a change occurred. So some people have actually argued that this neutral evolution model can give you a nice kind of S-curve trajectory on the basis that, well, it has to start from 0 when it's innovated, and it has to go to 1 at the point that the change has gone through. And then if you interpolate between something that goes from 0 and 1, then it's going to kind of look like an S-curve. So what this plot shows here is the probability distribution of the frequency of the innovation as a function of time. So the darker it is, the more likely a particular frequency of the innovation is over time. And if you average over this distribution, you get this nice smooth S-curve. Okay. So what this line here is, which you probably can't see, so there it is. What this line here is an average over a conditioned ensemble of language changes. So it could be argued that actually, once you average over these fluctuations, you do see the empirical data. However, I would say that that's not what you're doing with the empirical data. You're looking at individual instances of change. You are conditioning on the fact that change has happened, and then you're looking at single instances. And as we saw, those single instances have big fluctuations on them. Okay? You get this kind of going forward and coming back again. So we are actually sceptical as to whether you can actually advance this as a reasonable description of the data. So let's kind of go up this hierarchy of models. So the next one was this case of neutral interactor selection. So what that says now is that I'm allowed to differentiate between people by the frequency with which I interact with them, but you are not allowed to treat what I do differently to how I treat what you do. Okay, so me and Vittoria are symmetric, me and Eduardo are symmetric, and so on. But I'm allowed to interact with Eduardo and Vittoria at different frequencies. And this is the one that maps onto accommodation theory. So what it says is that if you just take this H function symmetric, the weight is symmetric, then you have accommodation theory. And I was very privileged the first time I gave this talk that Peter Drucker was actually in the audience, and he said, yes, that's exactly what my theory is saying. So I have this on very good authority. That's the kind of thing he was arguing for. And this is a very nice model because what it does is it makes a really quite, well, we thought surprising prediction was that it does not matter what interaction frequencies you have between pairs and how the social network structure is organized. It always takes the same amount of time for an innovation to propagate through the community. So the experts on voter models will know that this is a property that's associated with something called link dynamics, which is where you put links of update rather than individuals of update. And it basically comes down to the symmetry here, that the link is symmetric going both ways, so the probability that the innovation flows from one person to another is equal to probability it flows the other way. Okay. And a consequence of that is that no matter what social network structure you have, the time it takes for innovation to propagate through the community is independent of the social network structure, which is a really cool result, and there's a graph that demonstrates that it's true. And this was kind of useful for us to actually apply this accommodation theory to the case of new dialect formation in New Zealand. And what we found systematically was that when you take n up to realistically large speech communities, tens of thousands of speakers, then the time it would take for the propagation to go through the community was just way longer than the 50 years that the change actually happened on. So, so again, this type of model, not only does it have really big fluctuations in it, but it also implies very long change time scales. And it's the same sort of tennis analogy that is responsible for that. Good. So let's keep going and try and find a model that works. Okay, so weighted interactive selection. So this is now the case where you're allowed to have an imbalance between the impact that one person has on another and vice versa. Okay. So there's a very nice model of this in the literature by a guy called Rogers, who was most concerned about the diffusion of innovations in a general sense, usually technological innovations. So, so one of the examples he gives is boiling water in Peruvian villages. So trying to get people to boil their water so that they would be less susceptible to certain types of illnesses. And this was an innovation that failed to catch on due to various kind of complicated reasons. But he has this nice model where what he does is he divides his community into what he calls adopter categories. And he gives them a nice sort of binomial kind of shape distribution. So what you say is that there's a very small group of people who are the innovators. So about 15 years ago at a physics conference, these are the people who are using Macs as laptops. Okay? And then you have another group who are early adopters, who are people who kind of go, oh yeah, actually maybe I'll start using a Mac too, because because Victoria is using it. So on. Then you have the early majority, who like and the late majority and laggards. And the point in this model is that there's this kind of chain of influence. That there are some people who are very reluctant to adopt innovations, and they only do so once the majority of people have already adopted it. So you can divide people into these groups, and they can influence each other in this way. And the point is that the number of people in these groups follows this bell-shaped distribution. And the idea then is if you think now about the innovation propagating through the system, then it will necessarily start with a small number, it will start to get a bit faster, then it'll be very rapid, and then it will tail off. And this should generate the S-curve. Okay? Except that it doesn't. Okay? So if you actually put in exactly this structure into the model that we were just talking about, then you get something which could be a little bit S-like down here, but it's mostly just a kind of what people would call an R-curve, which is one that basically just goes straight to the innovation.
So Richard, so what you mean put in, you build a network
you build
where only these are connected?
That's right. So you build a network with, say, one innovator, straight to the innovation.
So Richard, so what you mean put in, you build a network
You build a
where
network.
only these are connected?
That's right. So you build a network with, say, one innovator who, say, collected to, I don't know, 10 early adopters, and then the 10 early adopters are whatever, 10 the next one, and so on. Okay? And the information can only flow one way. So the HIJ is kind of 1 going this way and 0 going that way. So it really would be kind of pushing it through this. And it's maybe a little bit S-like, but not very S-like, but actually by comparing this with other distributions, so if you now just take a uniform distribution of adopter categories, what we're saying is that every adopter category has the same number of people in it, then we get something, the S goes away. Okay? So this is very much an R-curve. On the other hand, if you take an exponential distribution, so if you say, okay, so there's, I don't know, 1 innovator, 10 early adopters, 100 early majority, 1,000 late majority, and 10,000 laggards, then you can start to get this thing which looks more like a classical S-curve. Okay. So the question is well, what do real-world adopter categories look like? So we've kind of gone into the literature just to try and find out some sizes of adopter categories. So this is a social linguistic study of Montreal French R, which has changed over time. And the things are shown in this plot. So this is, if you take the exponential distribution, so we're asking 2, 4, 8, 16, but the actual distribution kind of follows a different. Here's another social linguistic study. Again, here's the exponential distribution, and then there's a whole bunch of other partitioning of the community into the innovators and the laggards. Here, I think, is the nicest illustration of why this exponential distribution is not the appropriate one. So, one of the stylized facts of language change is that young women lead the change and old men are the laggards, basically. So what this says is that these old men, for this Rogers-type theory to work, is that the number of laggards, the old men, would actually need to exponentially outnumber this group called the majority, which is now in quotes because it's not the majority, it's exponentially outnumbered by old men. Okay, and this majority would need to exponentially outnumber them young women. But if you actually look at, this is Ghana actually, so if you're looking in Ghana where these things are, so the old men are up here, this group here, okay, and the young women are down there. So this is completely the wrong way round. Okay, so we're kind of skeptical that this type of explanation really works as a robust explanation for an S-shaped curve. Okay, so playing around with the social network, your interaction rates, by itself, you can keep trying, and you can engineer situations where it works, but you need a lot of parameter tuning, and one of the things we don't like is parameter tuning. Okay, so let's turn to the obvious explanation, the one that you'd have gone for straight away, but we have to try all the other explanations, which is replicator selection. You just say, I prefer capture Chesterfield, and boom, there you go, there's your S-curve. And what's interesting here is that you can play around with how well disposed people are to the innovations. You can set up different models, and you can say, you can say 60% of the community prefer couch, but 40% prefer Chesterfield. Okay, and still, even with that just slight advantage distributed across the community, you can still robustly get this kind of slow, fast, slow, S-curve type phenomenon. To just come back to this point about fixed points, I mean, any shared disposition towards the innovation will tend to destabilize the fixed point. And so the point being that when you were trying to just play around with the structure of the society, that wasn't a shared disposition. That was kind of built in. The asymmetry was just kind of built into the way that the innovation was supposed to flow through the society. Okay, and it would also predict that basically every change would flow through the same people each time. So here what we're saying that actually no, that somehow people have to acquire this disposition towards a particular linguistic variable, and then that will allow it to follow the attested curve. So let me summarize this part of the talk. The other part is just one slide, so we should finish in time for lunch. The take-home message really is that if you want the systematic propagation of an innovation, by systematic I mean that when you go to the data you see that there is this progression, it keeps increasing over a long period of time, it doesn't exhibit these wild fluctuations, you go and come back again. Then you have to have some asymmetry built in between the convention and the innovation, and you can build this asymmetry in two ways. You can either build it into the structure of the community by saying that there's this group of innovators and this group of laggards, and it kind of flows across the groups, but as we've seen it's quite difficult to make that work. Or you can build it into the actual behaviour itself, the replicators, and say that this way of doing things is just generally preferred by people, this way of doing things. Okay. And what we find is that, as I said, you can kind of classify things that if you put in this active identity type explanation, then you do get the S-curve. If you put in a more principal density type explanation, you tend not to get it. If you condition on the data, so if you just kind of say, I'm not interested in all those cases where innovations fail, and introduce the bias that way, so that's also introducing an asymmetry between convention and innovation, because you're saying I'm looking for conventions that get replaced. Then you find that, yes, you may get an S-curve, but it's a very noisy one. And there's one other case that I haven't talked about today. I have a PhD student working on it right now, which is actually a sort of a sensitivity to a change in program. So you kind of know that this variant appears to be increasing. more and more people are doing it. So this kind of gives some sort of momentum, if you like, to the change. And what this does actually, is one of the physicists, it builds in another type of asymmetry, which is time reversal asymmetry, but the forwards and backwards time dynamics are not the same because you're building in a momentum term. That looks like it could give you an S-curve, but this is work in progress. So actually all the work that we'll have to do is to try and distinguish between these two types of explanation, which is one is saying, yes, we just prefer this way of doing things for all reasons, versus this one's increasing, so we'll just keep increasing it because it's increasing. Okay, so there are kind of two explanations that might work. If we go for the identity explanation, there are still some puzzles here, and I think puzzles which are quite interesting to this group. So, and this is the one that's still confusing me actually. So, let's say couch is on the way in, okay? And we've said that in order for this to take over the entire speech community, you are this speech community, have to have this disposition towards couch. Okay, so where did that come from? Right? How did that spread through the speech community? Because, presumably at some point, no one thought couch was a great thing, which is why Chesterfield was stable. And then at some point, people have gone, no, okay, we're going to start saying couch instead. And somehow that bias needs to have spread throughout the community faster than the language. Okay, that's weird. Okay, so there's a puzzle. We also saw some of the data, like French negation, goes back to the 12th century. Okay, and systematically, generation after generation, they're marching across to completion, near completion. Now, I don't know how the situation. Maybe France has a really, really, really good health service, and people live 800 years. But I suspect that that's not the case, and in fact, what's so somehow, despite the fact that there can be no one who has seen any part of that, any significant part of that change, no one individual, it somehow just keeps going. So this preference somehow manages to spread quickly to a group and then gets kind of maintained culturally down the generations. And I actually have no idea how that happens, and so I think it's kind of an interesting question for people here. Okay, so in the last couple of minutes, I want to just touch on something that came up actually in the previous talk, and it's related to this. So the idea of universals and versus diversities. So there's a lot of diversity in the world's languages, but we kind of think that certain cognitive aspects of humans and their language behaviour should be pretty much the same from one person to another, no matter where they are in the world. Evidence for this is that if someone moves to another part of the world, they have a child, the child tends to know the language of the place they moved to, things like that. So, so this is the World Atlas of Language Structure. So people familiar with that? So it's basically just a big list of languages, and you can put out features. So 37A is the definite article, and there are 4 different ways of marking the definite article across the world's languages. And they're shown by these different colours. If you're kind of looking at this really carefully, you can see 5, but we put 2 of them together because all the white ones are no definite article. Okay. And an interesting, from a non-equilibrium statistical physics perspective, feature of this variation is if you look at the time course of change, it seems to happen in a fairly systematic order. Okay. So the first variant, let's say, so having no marker, I think, goes to something where the demonstrative and the definite are the same, then it goes to something where they're different, and then there's an affix, and it comes back to there being no marker again. And it goes around in what's called a grammaticalization cycle, which is just fascinating in its own right. Okay. Another thing is if you then look at the different languages and ask, which bits of the cycle have they exhibited, then across the same sort of 2,000-year period, you find some where it's changed 3 times and some where it's changed not at all. Okay, so there's not just diversity in the way of doing things, but there's also diversity in the timescales and the propensity to change across different communities. Okay, so any model that's appealing to universal principles to explain it, so you kind of say, this is strong evidence for some universal cognitive bias that tends to push you from having no marker to using a demonstrative. Okay, and then separating those into 2 separate words and then turning it into an affix. There's something going on in cognition which is biasing people that way around the cycle as opposed to going through some other route. But given that universal bias, you have to explain, okay, well, you end up with this huge diversity in timescales. So where does that come from? Now, what we think at the moment is that the most models that we've tried can't account for this, except for one that we've found. And the one that we've found She comes back to this point here. So you remember some of these S-curve trajectories, there were like 2 or 3 variants. So the French negation was the one where things were kind of stable for quite a long time, and the variants were always kind of sitting there, and then one of them took off. Okay? And we think that's essentially the mechanism that's going on here. So we would contend that what's universal is the innovation process, so that there is some cognition which, given if most people are using this, it tends to produce this in small numbers, sitting around in the community. But at some point, the community latches onto this innovation and decides somehow that this is to be preferred for some reason. That culturally, we now identify ourselves as being innovative in this particular way, and then because that's the next thing that's generated by cognition, that's then selected and so on to get a kind of innovation selection kind of cycle. And the idea is that the innovation part will be due to these kind of cognitive constraints and linguistic constraints and stuff which are broadly universal, but the actual thing which then decides that some of this variation is the thing that is going to take off and win is actually culturally specific. And it seems that quantitatively that kind of model works in a way that ones which rely purely on universal factors doesn't. So coming back to this kind of poetry kind of case is that yes, there is room for stuff to be universal in terms of the creative process, but the things which succeed, so say virtuoso poetry, would depend on which culture you happen to be in at a particular time. So that's kind of the thinking. Okay. But this is work in progress. We started it before my son was born, and it still hasn't been submitted for publication yet, but my jobs are stuck in a queue on the machine. Okay, good. So let's summarise and conclude and then have lunch. So to summarise, what I've tried to argue is that taking this sort of broader view of theory in terms of the principles of like symmetry, broad brush principles, allow you to build up a classification and a hierarchy of verbal theories, and then you can use that kind of in an operational way to sort of say this one seems to be more likely than that one. Okay, and I think that's useful. In the future, I mean, I've basically just outlined these things. So I've talked almost entirely about language, but of course that language isn't the only thing that's kind of culturally transmitted and shared. So you can ask questions about, is it universal across different domains of behaviour? These puzzles about how these shared preferences kind of get out there, how they get to be shared, how they manage to travel faster than the speed of language, I think is a very interesting question. And then there's this kind of interplay between universal factors and culturally specific factors. I think is a very general one, which hopefully none of us are interested in. Right, lunch.